Pack the coffins nice and tight. You won't make El Paso. You will all be muertos.
Pay no mind. Just trying to scare you.
I don't like him.
You'll be all right. You'll see.
Maybe you're not all gonna be muertos. Perhaps. I'll save a few.
Just move on. We're not hurting you.
You won't need this for long.
But we do need it tonight. This whole thing, it doesn't make any sense. Why do we have to leave our beautiful homes, and our farms?
I know it isn't easy. But it's just getting too dangerous here, and without our guns... Trust me, it's the right thing to do. The Lord will protect and provide.
Let's get everyone on board.
On July 28, 1912, during the height of the Mexican Revolution, thousands of Mormon colonists, mostly women and children, settlers from the United States who had been making their home in northern Mexico, were suddenly uprooted and under the necessity to flee for their lives with just a few hours' notice. They were unprepared for what awaited them across the border in El Paso. Fleeing Missouri in 1838 and Illinois in 1846, the Mormon faith has a history of being uprooted. In 1847, they established a home in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. From their base in Salt Lake City, the great colonizer Brigham Young sent settlers out to tame the desolate wilderness.
From the very early days of the church, the saints sought to move out and settle various locations to build religious communities, cities of Zion.
North into Canada and the northern states.
South from the Salt Lake Valley through southern Utah. They had moved into the Arizona Strip, Little Colorado area.
They went clear to California as part of the original state of Deseret. And so going to Mexico was a natural extension of the settlement.
In 1875, Brigham Young sent the first missionaries into Mexico with a dual purpose.
They're going to pave the way to find places that are suitable for colonization and also to preach the gospel.
Their purpose was to go to Sonora, but there was problems with the Yaqui Indians and the Mexican government, so they diverted to Chihuahua, and they entered in El Paso del Norte in January of 1876.
One of the things that first took them off guard was the reaction of a Catholic priest there named Padre Borrejo.
And the padre got up and said, God has sent us all kinds of plagues. We've had droughts and we've had terrible windstorms, we've had terrible flooding, we've had insects attack us. We have all kinds of plagues, but the most serious and the most difficult and the meanest plague we've got today is those 7 men that are standing there in the door, those Mormon missionaries.
It was after that encounter that they realized, especially James Stewart says, I began to study Spanish earnestly so that they could react to that to these people.
Brother Jones, being a good saddle maker, finally ended up making a saddle for the padre, and they became very good friends.
They took very detailed notes of where they went, where they traveled, even indicating that Casas Grandes would be maybe the most ideal place because of the turkeys and the other things that were available there.
Porfirio Diaz was encouraging foreign investment, economic development, and he viewed the Mormons as industrious and potentially advantageous to him in terms of economic development plans.
Their prowess and reputation as great agriculturists had preceded them. They knew how to make the desert bloom, and this is what was needed in Chihuahua.
This initial mission to Mexico ended in 1877, shortly after Brigham Young died, with few converts. In 1879, his successor, John Taylor, sent Apostle Moses Thatcher to Mexico City to speak with Mexican authorities and to dedicate Mexico for the preaching of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
One of the things that they felt very inspired about was the need for colonization in Mexico so the gospel could be spread.
In 1882, the U.S. government passed more stringent laws in regards to the Mormon practice of polygamy with the Edmunds Act. This made the need to colonize outside of the United States more urgent, and Mexico was soon looked to as a place of refuge. Mexico had similar statutes in place, but Porfirio Diaz told the Mormons, "It does not matter in Mexico whether you drive your horses tandem or four abreast." In other words, he would not enforce any such laws if the Mormons would make Mexico their home.
When Mormon leaders meet with Porfirio Diaz, he
welcomes them with open arms. And he arranges for many choice lands in northern Mexico to be made available for sale. And this alienates many Mexicans that had previously owned these lands.
They, in fact, forced the government to move the Mormons from their original locations that they had decided on and push them further north where the water was not as plentiful.
Even though these settlers had to abandon an entire canal system and dig another, they made the best of it. 6 communities were soon established in the state of Chihuahua, and 3 more in Sonora, complete with everything a small village might need.
The initial years were tough, getting set up, but once they got their land established, crops in, they thrived.
It had a hotel and it had factories and brick kilns and leather and clothing and fruit and animal breeding programs. It was a very, very busy place.
They were interested in a whole host of other things, improving their lives. They set up an educational system. They were interested in a holistic aspect to life.
In addition to science, math, bookkeeping, and agriculture, the Juarez Academy provided the community with a rich education in music, drama, and sports.
The Mexican government was very grateful to have them there because of how much they were producing by way of business and even their produce that they had and that they were sharing at the fairs.
They were beautiful little towns. Beautiful homes, 2-story, 3-story brick homes with orchards and trees. And to the other people around them, it looked like, well, you must have done that at our expense.
They almost became a poster child for Porfirio Diaz. He had them bring their goods to Mexico City for a display at a fair on sort of the industrialization and progress of Mexico. And they were, particularly the apples, they were a great hit in Mexico City.
The government paid to ship Mormon leather goods, brooms, dairy, clothing, rugs, produce, and photographs of their thriving colonies to the fair. Everything was so unbelievable that an ambassador was dispatched to verify their authenticity. These colonies were outstanding, even by United States standards. But instead of becoming excited for Mexico's progress under Diaz, the majority of Mexican citizens grew angrier because of the success of these American colonists. This was especially true with Chihuahua's Temochi Indians.
They had had a lot of trouble with the Mexican government at various levels. And one of their leaders was a man named Juan Sosa. And he came to Colonia Juarez during a downtime of the Temochi Indian rebellions and was working there. But he actually hated all white people, including white Mexicans of Spanish descent.
The Mexican government had a real problem. They knew there was a lot of unhappiness. They knew there was a lot of problems in places like Sonora and Chihuahua and the other northern states.
A landless peasantry, dispossessed middle class, economic difficulties, stark contrast between rich and poor.
The Mormons now were really hard-pressed. They represented not only foreign investment, but they had actually been given title to farmland, rich farmland, well-watered, and they had done well with it.
Finally, in 1910, a revolution ignited against the 30-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, financed by his chief rival, Francisco Madero.
It was relatively bloodless, let's say. Francisco Madero, its leader, with the help of some of the more famous generals like Pancho Villa, defeat the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in 1911, and very few casualties.
Then Madero went to Mexico City to form a new government, but he couldn't take everybody with him. So some of the people that he left behind in northern Mexico were unhappy.
General Orozco, General Jose Inez Salazar, and others rise up against President Francisco Madero. And this is when the revolution begins to become a lot more bloody.
The Mormons felt, even though they were neutral, they felt very exposed, and they felt like here we are in the middle of a very violent war,
And the leaders of the colonies got together and said, we need to have better rifles because the rifles of the rebels are higher powered and can reach a greater distance. And if they were to attack us, they would be able to do that without us being able to respond.
For a time, the U.S. government sold arms to these revolutionary forces in Mexico, and a number were also purchased and quietly brought into Mexico by these Mormon colonists, where they were safely concealed in the various colonies.
The United States prefers stability in Mexico in 1912, so it creates an arms embargo against the counter-revolutionaries, led by General Orozco and General Salazar.
Which meant that no other rifles or ammunition or arms could be imported from the United States into Mexico.
This angered revolutionary forces, and they began to eye Mormon weapons as something that they wanted to acquire.
Feelings of bitterness were already high due to an earlier incident between Mormon peacekeepers and local Temochi Indians.
Theft was rampant. They'd sneak into people's barns in the middle of the night and milk the cows, so that when you got up in the morning to go milk your cow, it had already been milked. And they would take saddles and food and blankets and whatever they could get.
The reputation of the Mormons in Mexico, in northern Mexico, is no se dejan. They won't put up with it. They will rebel if you attempt to coerce them or to extort from them.
They were going to have a trial to try to restore order so that the whole breakdown of the community didn't continue. And Juan Sosa said, if you do anything to these people, we'll kill you.
The trusted judge from Chihuahua City, Señor Jesus José Rodriguez, was incensed at Sosa's contempt and issued an order for the Mormon posse to apprehend him.
And he was in there irrigating with a shovel. And he stood on his side of the fence, and the white men stood on their side of the fence, and he taunted them and said, come and get me.
And he just began to call us everything that a human could think of. And old Frank started to crawl through the fence, and when he did, old Juan just tiptoed to hit him with a shovel, right, just kind of a glancing blow, you know, and just opened up his skull.
He just laid open his scalp, one of the deputies. And my grandfather, Jess Taylor, was one of the other deputies. And his cousin was the commander of the deputies, Guy Taylor. And when he raised the shovel up to hit the man again, the deputies were ordered to shoot him. So they did. They shot him and killed him.
They got this Rodriguez, and he came down, of course, and he was on our side, because he said, bring him, dead or alive, didn't make any difference. And of course there was quite a stir, you know, and excitement around town. There was 2, 3 of us went into hiding, you know, for a while, till they finally arrested us, you know, and well, I never expected to get away from there. There were several thousand men there. And when he got down there was old Rule Madera's brother. He told us to get up there and get on them horses of ours and never look back. We did.
Well, that really, I think, was the beginning of the end. We never had peace after that.
Meanwhile, the revolution grew more intense. On July 26, 1912, with the need for arms among the revolutionaries becoming desperate, Salazar summoned the Mormon leader Junius Romney to Casas Grandes.
He knew the Mormons had a lot of ammunition and arms, so he called in the stake president and some other leaders and said, we must have your guns and ammunition in order to defend ourselves. And the stake president said, we are neutral. We are not part of this battle.
Salazar, incensed, demanded further and sent some of his guard with Romney back to the colonies to assure that his order was carried out.
Salazar said, if you do not deliver us your guns and ammunition, then we will go from house to house and door to door and kill every man, woman, and child and confiscate these rifles because we must have them.
Romney and other leaders devised a strategy whereby they would collect the oldest guns that were in the colonies, some non-functioning by that time, and hide away their best arms. And so they did that.
But they recognized at the time that their families were no longer under the protection, had any protection from the rebels.
So what are they going to do? You got lawless bands running all over. And so he made the only logical decision.
To send the women and the children out first and leave the men in the colonies to look after their homes and their ranches and their property.
My father told us that they had decided that it would be best for all the women and children at least to leave and for people to evacuate. And there would be a train the next day to take the women and children to El Paso.
I was just 9 years old, and I sat up all night watching my mother make cookies and pack, and you could only take one trunk and a few bedding. Mama was crying and crying and crying, and I was sitting there just tickled to death.
I think a lot of them, in the back of their mind, may have known that this revolution may eventually touch their lives, but that wasn't a question they really wanted to entertain. Now here it was, from one day to the next, right in their face. They're given almost no time. Pack what you can pack, less than 100 pounds, and get out.
Which they began to do on the railroad that went up to El Paso, traveling on cattle cars in any way to get up to El Paso. And that continued then for several days until all the women and children were evacuated from the Chihuahua colonies.
All the work, all the labor, all the effort that had gone in to establishing these colonies, their homes, their fields, everything, not to mention their lifestyle.
The wisdom in leaving the colonies manifested itself the very next morning as rebels harassed and looted from the colonists all the way to the station. And it didn't end there.
They said, you won't get any farther than the bridge. They said, we'll blow that train up. But we thought we'd just as well be blown up on the bridge as farther down the line. So we just all got on the train and came along, and we were so thick in there that, it was terrible, and we didn't have any water and very little food, and we had all of the sick people there was in Colonial Juarez on that train.
We were crammed in there like sardines in a can. There wasn't any water. We ran out of water. Kids bawling. There wasn't room to sit down on the seat. You had to sit anywhere and everywhere.
It was just a long, hot, miserable ride. And Mother, who had a tiny baby, was really miserable.
They put all the women and children and all the men that were connected with the killing of Juan Soso, they put them on the train, some of them in disguise.
It was after midnight on July 28, 1912, before the train cleared customs and finally rolled into the El Paso depot. The 350 passengers had escaped Mexico with their lives. But they couldn't help but wonder what awaited them now in a strange city without their husbands and fathers.
Where were they going to stay? How were they going to deal with the children? Where were they going to put them that would protect them?
As Mormon agents Anthony W. Ivins and Orson Pratt Brown negotiated the refugees' rail transportation, Henry Eyring Bowman prepared their accommodations. The unrestrained tears which accompanied his passionate plea so moved the mayor and Chamber of Commerce that they immediately jumped into action.
The city of El Paso really stepped up to the occasion.
El Paso has this open door policy for all people, especially the downtrodden and the folks that are being abused, whether it's politically or religiously. We've welcomed them all, and we continued to do that in 1912 when we had the exodus coming up from Mexico.
They provided bedding, they provided clothing, food, money, whatever really was needed.
People opened their houses so that they could take showers and things like that. So it was a proud moment in El Paso's history.
They suddenly found themselves at the mercy of those who were willing to be charitable to them, and that was a new experience. They were used to being the ones who gave out charity, not the ones who received it.
You know, to have a taxi cab driver say, you know what, you need the help and I need to help you. Just get in the cab and I'll give you a ride. That's pretty cool.
They felt like the people of El Paso were just angels to send them ice and food and meet.
And I'll never forget when we landed in El Paso, and the United States government were very good to us. They fixed a place up out in East El Paso then, and it was an old lumber yard, but they fixed it up and so that people could live there.
The only privacy they had was stringing up wires and hanging quilts to divide off from one family to another family. And the city of El Paso was very good. They brought in 2 or 3 restaurant-sized stoves and where they could cook.
Most of the people went down to the lumber yard simply to ask, how can we help? How can we alleviate your suffering? What can we do to help out your family? So this is a time where El Paso, I think, is at its best.
A gentleman came with a buggy, took children for rides around the city of El Paso, took them to see the alligators in San Jacinto Plaza. That kind of outpouring of love to people.
The people of El Paso were just trying hard to make them comfortable in an uncomfortable situation.
Fort Bliss brought out tents and food and sanitary supplies and such to help these people.
The U.S. military was also helpful in other ways. Colonel E.C. Stever, commander of the 4th Cavalry at Fort Bliss, assigned the Fort Bliss Band to provide frequent concerts for the community in Cleveland Square. He was also quick to petition Washington for additional supplies.
Local officials in the El Paso city area and county area lobbied the Congress to get money appropriated to help. But the initial initiative was Colonel Stever's, and we're very, very proud of that.
Thousands of dollars were appropriated in the U.S. Congress to buy food and tents and supplies for the Mormon refugees, and they rushed them to the people in El Paso.
I shall always be grateful for the good old USA. They really did take care of us. They fed us, they housed us, they paid our doctor bills, they gave our men employment. Morning after morning they brought truckloads of good food when otherwise we would have suffered to no end.
Over the next several days, additional train loads of Mormon women and children caused this group to swell to several thousand refugees, as the hospitality provided by the good people of El Paso caused tears of gratitude to course down the cheeks of these women and children. Their husbands and fathers were back in Mexico, trying to protect their homes and livelihoods. However, after just 1 week, it became apparent that staying would be too dangerous even for them. Junius Romney soon called a meeting for all remaining colonists at the stairs, sort of a midway point between the mountain colonies and the valley colonies.
They were waiting about 2 days for other colonies to come there with people, and eventually about 250 men gathered there with maybe 400 head of horses.
After 2 days of waiting for the outlying colonies to arrive, and receiving reports that they would be detained several additional days, the decision was made to break camp and head for the United States border on horseback, where the others could join them later.
Some 235 of them with horses and wagons then marched northward across the desert, trying to avoid the forces of the rebels who were in the area.
When they approached the U.S.-Mexican border, American military units thought that they were approaching Mexican rebels.
They were carrying a white flag, but the cloud of dust which they raised was such that it was difficult to see the flag or even who the people were. The detachment of American soldiers who were behind a rock wall defending the border looked at these people as Mexicans who were going to invade the United States. But before they began to fire on these intruders, one of the soldiers looked and identified one of the Mormons who were there and said, "Hold your fire."
Men on both sides of the border were relieved that no shots had been fired. Some days later, after arriving in Achita, New Mexico, the majority of the men caught the train to El Paso to rejoin their wives and children.
The United States government very generously provided free railroad passage to all of these refugees to let them go wherever they wanted to go, so they could go to their people, whether they were in Arizona or Utah or New Mexico or wherever they were.
Once these families were reunited, the decision whether to establish new homes in El Paso or to go on to other destinations became a personal decision for each family.
Most did not return to Mexico, but they were very faithful, active Latter-day Saints, and they enriched the communities in which they ended up in.
Some of them felt so welcomed here that they found this was going to be their new home, and they raised their children here. They ended up having grandchildren here.
After they were here for about 20 years, they built this beautiful chapel. Actually, one of my grandfathers, my great-grandfather, a cousin of my other grandfather were all members of the building committee that helped design and build this chapel.
Today we have over 9,000 members of the church here in El Paso throughout the whole community, ingrained not only in the business part of the community but in the military and in other major businesses, as well as in the school districts here in El Paso, and it's been a great partnership with the community.
The Mormon colonies in Mexico really was a small group of colonies, 4,000 people more or less, but they've had a tremendous impact on the church. If you were to check the early records of missionaries throughout Latin America, a disproportionate percentage would have surnames who come from the colonies. That eventually allows the gospel to be spread throughout Latin America. It's in a way, a testament to the faith, sacrifice, and obedience of these early saints who formed these little enclaves in northern Chihuahua and Sonora.
There are now 25 missions in Mexico. There are 222 stakes in Mexico. There's 12 operating temples and 1 under construction, and over 1 million members today in the Republic.
On behalf of the many people who descend from these 1912 refugees, may I express my own profound thanks to your parents and grandparents, the noble and great citizens of El Paso. What they did for our people was gracious, kind, and benevolent. A century ago, Latter-day Saint members of the El Paso Relief Committee expressed their thankfulness in an article prepared for the El Paso Times. Along with this Relief Committee, I too say, may he who regards all people according to their works do unto you and yours as you have done unto us. Thank you to the people of El Paso for all that was done. It is not forgotten, nor will it ever be.